The year is 1066, and the fate of England hangs in the balance. Picture a kingdom trembling under the weight of invasion, where three rival claimants, Harold Godwin's son, Harold Hardrada, and William of Normandy, clash for the crown. On the windswept fields of Hastings, armored knights and weary huscarls lock in a battle that would change the course of English history forever. Out of this single, bloody day emerges not just a new king, but the foundations of an entirely new England. But the story of medieval England is far more than knights and conquests. It is 1,000 years of upheaval, ambition, and transformation. It is a land of kings and peasants, castles and cathedrals, plague and rebellion, a world where loyalty and betrayal often decided who lived and who was executed. After William the Conqueror seized the throne, England was reshaped with an iron fist. Castles rose from the earth like teeth, looming over villages as symbols of Norman dominance. The language of the elite shifted, French in the courts, Latin in the churches, English on the tongues of commoners. Even the very idea of who owned the land was rewritten in the Domesday Book, a colossal survey that left no cow, no plough, no patch of field unrecorded. For the first time, England became a kingdom catalogued, counted, and ruled from the top down. Yet kings were not invincible. Consider King John, remembered less for victories than for his failures. Arrogant, unpopular, and ruthless, he taxed his nobles until they revolted. The result? A piece of parchment in 1215 that became one of history's most famous documents, the Magna Carta. Though its clauses were narrow, written for barons rather than commoners, it planted a seed, the idea that even a king must bow to the law. Centuries later, that idea would inspire revolutions across the world. Medieval England was also the age of cathedrals, vast stone giants like Canterbury and York Minster. To a medieval peasant who had never traveled more than a few miles from home, these soaring arches and stained-glass windows must have seemed like the very hand of God carved into stone. Religion was not a part of life, it was life. Every day was ordered by the tolling of church bells, every year by the liturgical calendar. Pilgrims trudged across the land to visit relics, hoping for healing or redemption. And yet, beneath this devotion, cracks of doubt sometimes surfaced, mystics, heretics, and reformers who whispered that the church itself was corrupt. But no force shook England more violently than the Black Death. In 1348, the plague arrived, carried by fleas and rats, sweeping through towns and villages with terrifying speed. Families died so quickly that corpses were left unburied, piled into mass graves. Entire villages vanished from the map. In just a few short years, nearly half of England's population was gone. For survivors, the world was never the same. With so many dead, laborers could demand higher wages, and suddenly the rigid feudal order began to crack. Kings faced their own trials. Edward III waged war with France, beginning the 100 Years' War, a conflict that saw English armies like those at Crécy and Agincourt win astonishing victories against all odds. Imagine English longbowmen, muddy and exhausted, unleashing a storm of arrows that cut down armored French knights like wheat before a scythe. Yet these triumphs faded, and by the end, England had lost nearly all its continental possessions. Still, the war left behind something more enduring, a rising sense of English identity. Then came the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle that reads like the pages of a Shakespearean tragedy. Lancaster against York, red rose against white, cousin against cousin. The throne changed hands again and again, as kings were crowned and toppled in brutal succession. It was during this chaos that figures like Richard III emerged, shrouded in mystery and controversy. Was he the villain who murdered his nephews in the Tower, or merely a king smeared by his enemies? His bones, discovered centuries later beneath a car park in Leicester, still whisper questions of betrayal and ambition. And through all this, the ordinary people of England lived lives of hardship, resilience, and occasional joy. Most were peasants, bound to the land, working dawn to dusk for their lords. Their diets were plain, bread, pottage, ale, but festivals, fairs, and feasts lit up the monotony of rural life. In towns, guilds of merchants and craftsmen grew powerful, shaping the early stirrings of an economy that would one day fuel England's rise. By the end of the medieval period, England was unrecognizable from the land William had conquered centuries earlier. Castles still dotted the landscape, but gunpowder was making them obsolete. The church still held power, but murmurs of reform grew louder. The old feudal bonds had loosened, replaced by something new, a kingdom inching toward the modern age.